Today's video, the Angry Netrunner. Like with all the other illustration discussion videos I've done, the initial layout was done with a 2H Staedtler pencil. I don't film that section because it really just doesn't show up on camera very well. So then I just jump directly into the inks for these videos. The basic idea for this particular piece was it's loosely based on a photo I'd taken of one of the models that I work with. Kind of well, as the title says, it'd be an angry hacker, netrunner, computer interface jockey. There's a lot of different ways to discuss that kind of a character in a cyberpunk environment. But I want something a bit angrier, a bit more menacing, somebody a bit more on the edge than in some of the previous cyberpunk pieces I've been doing. Still all working towards this particular story I'm working on, helping develop the setting, characters in that setting. So this is being done 11 inches by 17 inch Strathmore Bristol paper, 100-pound weight, smooth surface. Like I just said, the initial layout was with a 2H Staedtler pencil. Although the composition was put together, you can see in the upper left-hand corner there, on my Samsung tablet. I'll use that tablet sometimes for breakdowns. Some of the earlier videos in this series actually show me working on it. It's a Samsung Galaxy 6 Lite tablet. Very, very nice, very intuitive for doing quick sketches with, using Ibis Paint X. So yeah, I put together the rough composition using that. Did the layout on paper with the 2H pencil. I tend to have a very light hand, so that also works. That also means that it really just can't show up on camera very well. But now going and doing the inking. Since I have rediscovered the proper techniques for using Crowquill pen, pretty much all the inking I do on these pieces is done with a Crowquill pen. I'll go between that and a Speedball lettering pen and a brush, but no other tools were used on this particular piece. And so the bulk of this is done with a Crowquill drawing pen, using super black India ink. And the basic premise, the pose of the character is that she is angrily looking at this little 1950s style robot action figure that she is crushing in her hand. What that actually means is kind of up to the viewer. There's a lot of questions I like to leave unanswered in some of these illustrations. I like the idea of playing with story. I want there to be a story going on. But I don't necessarily want to explain what that story is to the viewer. I want the viewer to be able to bring their own interpretation to the particular piece. So she's standing on this raised platform in this same high-tech environment that a few of my recent illustrations have been set in. It's basically this large arcology, this habitat that's actually set here in Winnipeg, in the city I live in a future version of the city that I'm building out for this particular story idea I'm working on. With a lot of computer monitors and such behind her. Now, there are large areas of white that I'm just leaving being white. Those computer monitors in particular. The reason for that is I'll be dropping other artwork into that when I get to the coloring stage. When I scan this final image and drop in and start doing the coloring in Photoshop, I'll actually be dropping in other artwork into those images in much the same way that I'll be dropping in advertising and other elements like that in the final story that I'm putting together. So this Netrunner character also has a cybernetic right arm, a very overly expressive, definitely an exaggerated arm, not completely anatomically correct. I wanted it to be a bit, frankly, I want the entire character to be a little bit more exaggerated than a lot of the figures I've been working on lately. Just adding a little bit more energy into the piece, a little bit more energy into the character, knowing that the upper half of the face of the character is actually going to be blocked. She's wearing this large net running headset, not too dissimilar from, virtual reality headsets of today, or even the that new Apple. Oh gosh, I've already forgotten what the name of it is, but basically any of those virtual reality headsets. I wanted something similar to that, much larger and more and bulkier. Clearly something that could do more than what those can, being set in this future world. But giving her this large face mask will rob a lot of opportunity for emotion and expression. So I wanted to heighten the expression in the rest of the figure. The rest of her face will be slightly outsized. The rest of the figure will be a little bit longer. Her limbs are a little bit longer and a little bit more ungainly, I guess is probably the best way to put it. So they can be more expressive and just slightly cartoonish, but more just an exaggerated version of a person. But still building out this, the background right now, this highly detailed, collection of monitors and computer interfaces. As I've talked about before, when I do my initial composition, I work from the main character or main characters outwards. I'll work basically from front to back. The main character is the focus, and then I build out everything else around them to build out the environment that they're in. But once I got the layout done, once I have that initial composition put together, all the other steps I tend to work from front to back. So in this case, I am doing the inking of this section of wall that's fairly close to her, and only adding an outline to the character when it would intersect with that wall. Now, one slight difference in this piece versus some of the previous ones I've been doing is I didn't start with the furthest background element. Everything on the right-hand side of the page behind her is actually much, much further back in space. But a lot of that's going to be basically consisting of very heavy blacks. I'm going with the notion that this is a 3-layer illustration. The deep background. The middle ground, which would be that collection of computer monitors and interfaces behind her. And then the foreground, which would be the main character and the railing she's standing directly in front of. And one way to establish these 3 layers is roughly one is black, one is gray, and one is white. Now, what does that mean when you're working entirely in black and white with no shades of gray? It has to do with the intensity, the busyness of the inks, the amount of ink detail you're putting into an image. Essentially, the more detail there is, the grayer the overall piece becomes. Like if you're looking at this right now and you squint your eyes, that entire wall, with the exception of the large white areas that I'll be putting other imagery into, it kind of goes gray. The elements behind that, the much further back background, will mostly be consisting of these large swaths of almost pure black. There won't be nearly as much detail in the deepest background. So essentially, that deep background will be the black layer. This wall behind her is the gray layer, and then the element, the main character, and this railing she's standing against, which I'm working on right now with the Crowquill. That'll mostly be considered, well, from my perspective, will be considered the white layer. Now, truthfully, the largest areas of white that will remain after painting will be in the main character. It'll be, she won't have as much detail on her as will the that wall behind her, or even the railing she's leaning up against, or directly in front of. The deep background won't have as much detail either, but it'll mostly be consisting of black space rather than white space. So that's a very convenient way of separating planes, separating layers in a black and white illustration. If you're not going to go for gray washes and different ink washes and stuff, this is, again, my approach to all these pieces is that the final ink piece itself needs to be a standalone image. They all sit in these portfolio books that I have, and I want all of them to be their own piece of artwork. I want there to be a full story being told just by looking at the black and white line art. It doesn't require color. Having said that, these are being done with the intent of being colored, and I will be adding in additional effects once I'm doing the colors. But that would be a separate piece of artwork. And it won't just be dependent on just the color portion of it in order for the image to make sense. Probably the biggest difference between the final black and white line art and the full color version will be the images in those computer monitors. But the images in those computer monitors are not integral to the story I think I'm telling. Also, they're not necessary for there to be the intent, for the intent to be obvious that there is a story happening. They'll add a layer to that storytelling, certainly, once the colored portion is finished. But the black and white line art will stand on its own without having anything there. They're also small enough pieces of white that it shouldn't draw the viewer's attention too directly, too much towards just these blank areas. Fundamentally, I'm always going to want the viewer's eye to be drawn to the main character. As much detail as I put into these backgrounds, and I put in a lot, there comes a point where there's so much detail kind of disappears. It becomes this gray layer, like I was talking about earlier. And that's done very consciously. I want there to be this texture of this technology that's informing the main characters, informing the world they live in. But it's not about that background. The story that's happening is about her. It's not about the setting. She's just a part of this world. Now, there are several reasons why I like working from back to front, from creating this elaborate setting and then ending with concentrating on the main character. Probably the biggest reason for me is that, frankly, the character is the most fun to draw in any particular illustration I'm working on. So I like saving it for last. This way, I find I'm not rushing through things. I do work very fast, but there's a difference between working fast and rushing. And if I find if I draw the main character, if I do an inked version of the main character, or when I go to the coloring step, I start by coloring the main character. Well, then I'm not as interested in the background, and I will take shortcuts on the background just to get it done. Whereas if I start with the background and I'm leaving the main character for last, it certainly runs the risk of you're going to rush through the background to get to the good part. However, because I'll also use the background as a way to inform a lot of decisions on the character, chiefly lighting effects. If I create an interesting light source in the background, I want that to appear on the main character to show that they're actually inhabiting that environment. This means I will spend more time on the background developing those possible elements that can affect the main character. To make everything a little bit more realistic isn't always the right word. I'm not going for photorealism or anything like that, but I want this illustration to have a certain reality to it. This isn't just going to be a pinup of a character in front of a wall. This isn't just going to be, I don't want it to look like it could just be a cardboard cutout of a character in front of any random wall. I want it to look like a three-dimensional person living and interacting in a three-dimensional environment. So the more detail I spend on the background, which can then influence the main character, the more real everything becomes. This gives the viewer, it invites the viewer to take things more seriously, to take it that as exaggerated as her pose will be and that her features could be, there's still an underlying reality here, that this all still feels like there's an actual story worth paying attention to going on. And yeah, I just find that for me, that works best by concentrating on the background and then moving to the foreground. Now, I've done most of the middle ground, that one wall behind her, and wanting to develop this railing. It's a part railing, part computer complex that she's kind of leaning up against, that she's holding on to. That's right behind her. But now I'm just quickly outlining the rest of the character so that I can finish that railing, but also then start working on the main background, that deep background. Now, the deep background won't be affecting her very much. It's another good reason for not really starting with it. There really won't be any lighting effects in that distant background that would affect her. However, the light from those computer monitors directly behind her, and light bouncing around the environment off that console could be affecting her. So I wanted to get as much of that down as I could. But now I'm getting into what is the deepest background. So this is taking place in this same sort of arcology that I've been developing in a few of these illustrations. That'll be for this story I'm working on here at the start of 20. Well, actually, this illustration was the last illustration I finished in the year 2024. So all this is being drawn in late December 2024. Putting together this video. This is the first. This is the last illustration I'm doing for 2024. This will be my first video of 2025. But yeah, as of putting all of this together, this is still developing this setting for this story I've been working on for the past year, where it's this arcology space. There's this interior open atrium with multiple levels going on surrounding it. Kind of basically a large mall, but that also acts as a living space. So here I'm drawing out these various levels to this inner atrium. Now, even these levels are compartmentalized. It's basically a series. The arcology itself is composed of multiple segments. Each of those segments is about 10 stories tall. So one segment will have an open atrium area with 10 levels inside of it. And then above that will be another separate, basically another stacked building sitting on top of it. They'll all have similar characteristics. All of them, or almost all of them, will have a central large statue figure. And if you go back and look at the first of these illustration discussion videos, that particular piece has an illustration of one of those statues in it. This one will have one, but you can't see it from this particular angle. So in this particular angle, mostly all you're seeing is these levels to different floors of the mall or arcology area. And you can see that most of that interior was painted using a brush rather than the Crowquill pen. The layout for each level was quickly drawn in using the Crowquill, but then I went in and did a lot of quick illustrations with a freehand with the brush, so that it's mostly in black. I didn't want to put in too much detail. Again, we're dealing with the furthest background being black, the middle ground being gray, and then the main character being white. She won't quite be completely open. The line work won't be quite that open. But that's roughly a good way to separate the planes, to think of it that way. Now, clearly, there's a lot of white space in that background, but not a lot of detail. You can see figures walking on those various levels, but you can't really make out any details. You can't make out any particular features on those characters that are walking and living their lives. There's enough motion back there that you can see something's happening, but they're all in silhouette. They're all being backlit, and massive amounts of shadow in that deep background. But now continuing with this kind of gray level, the middle plane is clearly split between that wall with all the computer monitors and this sort of console and railing thing that she's holding on to, and that's directly behind her. And you can also see that there are wires coming off of the console. They're going around behind her and back into the back of her head, more specifically into the back of the net running goggles. Now, starting to work on the actual details of the cybernetic arm of this character. As I said, very exaggerated cybernetic arm. I've done some cybernetic parts on these characters in this series of videos. Up until now, they've been more or less realistic. In this one, though, again, I wanted to make everything about the character be a little bit more exaggerated, add a little bit more emotion into her body language and just overall feel, because of her eyes being completely blocked off, most of her face being completely covered up by those net running goggles. It isn't really, this particular arm really isn't based on any particular design. It's a spin on various cybernetic arm designs I've done over the years. But the main thing that jumped out at me when I was coming up with this composition with regard to the arm is that I wanted the bicep to actually be open, to make it look as though you're just looking at the interior bones with a great big open space between them that is not covered over. Now, we haven't got to that part yet. The other part is that it's not, it's almost bolted into her shoulder. You'll actually, as it goes along, you'll actually see where I'm having the skin warp and be wrinkled where that whole piece has been fastened in. It's not a terribly elegant design. Not quite cobbled together. Clearly, the arm will look like it is purpose built. But it won't be, this is meant to be like high-end cybernetics of this future. It's much more textured. It's much more, be a lot more character, frankly. And this is where I'm drawing the interior space. So that hole in the middle of her arm there is a hole. Like, you'll be seeing design work on the wall behind her through that hole. It'll be even more obvious once I get to the color stage. But once I put in that detail, it's even obvious right here, where you can see the where the ink lines of the arm are very curved. All the ink lines on that wall are very horizontal and vertical. They're all much, all right angles. So even just doing that makes those two elements stand out from each other. And it makes it more obvious that that's not just a pattern on her arm, but it's actually something you see through a hole in the middle of her arm. Little things like that can really add to the reality of a setting. That I'm making a very clear distinction between her arm and that wall. Both are very clearly high-tech elements. A lot of computer panels, a lot of interfaces into those computers on that wall, and the arm itself being entirely made of metal. It'd be very easy for having those to have those two elements kind of fall into each other. But the fact that everything in the arm is very curved, it's very circular, with larger areas of white left open, that stands out quite a bit from that wall, where really the only white elements are those computer screens, and the white portion of the danger stripes, but even that has a fair amount of detail in it. So, now I've talked about in some of the other videos, when putting line art onto flesh, onto an actual figure, the more line art you add to the figure, to add texture, to add detail, essentially the older the figure looks. And with a lot of the pieces I've done up to this point, I've not put in a lot of detail, ink detail onto the figure. I tend to leave that for the coloring portion. I'll just leave it as a lot of white space for the inks. However, for this particular character, she is so exaggerated. She has, clearly her jaw is slightly larger than an actual human being's would. All of her teeth are actually very pointy. Those could be cybernetic augmentations. But it's all very exaggerated. So I want to do that with the character as well. So as I go along, not only have I put in a fair amount of detail on the arm, on the wires coming off of that headgear she's wearing, so it resembles hair, but I'm also putting in a lot more detail onto the flesh itself. I'm defining the musculature and the skeletal structure quite a bit more than I have in a lot of the recent pieces, the recent illustrations that I've done. That's to go with that exaggerated feel. It's to give her a very distinct look compared to the figures in the other pieces I've done. I want to vary them a little bit more as I'm going along. This may end up being a character in the book that I'm working on. I'm not entirely certain, but I wanted to, play with giving somebody, frankly, a lot of visual character. Now, these overlapping belts, these are a thing that I've done quite a bit, and I've done in recent illustrations. It works extremely well with the whole cyberpunk aesthetic. There's nothing they're really holding up in this particular piece. They're not in other illustrations. I've had them where a piece of computer equipment was being held down, or tools, things like that. This one, from the front anyway, you really can't see anything. It's entirely possible she may have a series of pockets holding tools or smaller computer equipment on the side away from the viewer. But really, it was just to maintain that same kind of overlapping belt aesthetic that I like playing with. And here, putting in a lot of detail for the pants, keeping the texture of these pants separate from the other elements of clothing, and certainly then the skin. Now, right now, the pants have large areas of white that seem to be outlined. Those will actually be filled in with black. That's another good way to keep textures of different items of clothing different from each other. so that the two shirts she's wearing will not look like the same kind of fabric as the pants that she's wearing, breaking up the textures in her belts. It could indicate that the belts could be leather, but a different type than the pants themselves. It's entirely possible those belts are actually plastic. Be especially common for a more 80s or 90s aesthetic. I still hadn't nailed down what my color choices were going to be at this point, so it gave me a lot of room to work with. But yeah, filling in those large areas of black on the pants helps to separate all the various portions of the main character while still keeping her as the quote-unquote white portion of the illustration, the keeping of the white plane. Now, to reinforce the separation of these planes, I'm now going over using a different Speedball lettering pen and some Dr. P.H. Martin's white Bombay ink. Throwing in, adding an extra line here or there to separate the main character from her environment. Also just to heavily reinforce that notion that she's separated from it. Doing a few additional lighting effects here and there, but compared to some of the stuff I've been doing lately, I'm not actually using the white all that much. Adding a bit of this white outline around the main character is probably the biggest thing I'm doing. I had already left in a lot of white space, like where she is crushing that robot in her hand. I had actually left in huge sections of white to give the impression that as she's crushing the robot, bits of it are flying through space, bits of it are flying through the air. So the robot itself is not completely detailed. That extra white space gives a sense of movement. It's a very common thing in comic book style illustration. I didn't actually add speed lines, but instead just left these white areas. I'm also tapping some dots of extra white into that gray layer, the quote-unquote gray ink layer, and then adding in my signature in white at the bottom. This element, this piece is now scanned. I scanned it at full size, so it's scanned at 11 by 17 inches at 1200 DPI. I like to do all my scans at a super, super high resolution like that. But then when I go to paint it, I drop it down to 600 DPI, but still at full size, still at 11 by 17. That gives me a lot more options with regard to printing it later. Now, I am in Photoshop using the Quick Mask tool, so using the Lasso tool and the Quick Mask to select the deep background layer. I'm going to be putting this line art onto a separate layer. Basically, I've talked about this before. One way to look at painting in Photoshop is though it's a series of sheets of Mylar. The very bottom sheet will be where the background colors will be. On top of that will be a layer of the background line art. On top of that, I can put any special effects that will only affect the deep background colors and the deep background line art. Above that will be a coloring layer for the middle ground. In this case, that wall directly to to the viewer's left, to the character's right. And so you can see here where I've already cut out that background black layer from the line art. So that's going on this separate layer. I will then create a separate layer that it consists just of the background wall. So that'll basically be the middle ground. So I'll be putting down flat colors behind that, then drop that layer of ink on top of it, then a final coloring layer, which will be the main character and the railing and computer equipment just behind her, with that line art in front of that. That makes it, separating out this way makes it a lot easier for me to do things like very much Ridley Scott or Tony Scott style lighting effects. I like doing these kind of that style of lighting effect on these cyberpunk pieces. So again, I've isolated the background, the middle ground line art onto its own layer. So I'm just sorting everything out and now dropping in a flat color into the deep background, then creating a new layer for the middle ground. That'll just be that wall behind her. I'll drop in separate colors there on that other layer, and then just keep stacking it that way. Now this is what's called the flatting portion of any of these pages, where I'm putting down flat colors that I will then go later and paint over. This is done, it basically makes it easier to make any changes to any coloring you want to do. This is a very common technique in comic book illustration and comic book coloring, which is where I got my start professionally in comics, working at a company here in Winnipeg, Digital Chameleon, where we were doing coloring work for Marvel Comics, DC Comics, Dark Horse, Topps, all kinds of different things. I was there from 1997 until 2003 when the studio closed. And then after that was working freelance in comics, movies, video games, TV, some book publications, things like that. But that's where I learned the bulk of the computer coloring portion. That's why I have a very particular way of working on computer coloring based on learning it at that period. So there's a lot of things I do here that are very... they're rooted in me wanting to save memory in a way that you really don't have to anymore. But old habits die hard, and I'm fine with that. The fact that I'm putting all these layers of line art, all these pieces of line art into different layers to make the special effects easier to do later on, that by itself is a huge use of memory compared to how we used to do this back in the day. Okay, so I've got the deep background color dropped in, which won't be the color that background is in the final version. But it's just a holding color with the line art for it on top of it. Then the middle ground, I dropped in flat colors, which again won't be the final colors those will end up being, with the line art for that middle ground on top of it. And now I'm putting in the flat colors for the foreground and main character. And once again, these won't be the same colors I'll be using to color with. There was a time that I actually preferred making these holding colors almost exactly the opposite of what I wanted the colors to be, so that I wouldn't forget and miss a piece later on. I don't quite do that anymore. I tend to have a set group of colors I always use, knowing that I'll be able to go back and select them and paint them later. But honestly, yeah, it doesn't matter what I make these colors at the moment. This weird brownish, vaguely brownish green, brownish yellowish green that I'm doing for these wires going up to the equipment on her head. This will not be the color that these are going to be. I already know going into this that I'm wanting to do basically a red-blue color scheme on this particular piece, but this will just keep it very easy for me to select all of this later when I actually want to start coloring. When I lay down the flat colors, I lay them all down from back to front. And then when I do the actual coloring, the actual painting, I'll be doing that all back to front. So everything except for the initial composition in my pieces are done, with very few exceptions, from back to front. It's just how I prefer working. Again, it means that I can keep, if I decide I want to have the foreground very red, that means by default I want the background to be very blue. It's easier for me to figure it out. The opposite, however, that if I go into this and decide just to paint with a lot of blue colors in the background, by default I'll be having to use a lot of reds in the foreground, so they help separate from each other. I'm using a very traditional comic book color for the flesh tones here. Once again, knowing that I will not be using this color in the final painting. Oh, and the color of the line art. You notice that I did fill in on the various layers. I'd filled in that line art with black, but right now the deep line art is this magenta, this kind of red, and the color of the line art in the middle ground is this neon green. Those are the colors of the channels that I used when I separated out the line art for the different layers. I actually first separated them to different channels, which is a thing you can do with Photoshop. And then if you turn the eyeball on the channel, you can change what that color looks like. It doesn't affect the printing at all. It doesn't affect what the final thing is going to look like. But basically I did that here to remind myself this section of line art is going to be on a layer behind where I'm putting down these flat colors. So I don't want to be putting any colors that would overlap with that. So wherever there's neon green, I do not want to put another chunk of color, because if I put a chunk of color over that, it will actually paint over that neon green, the quote unquote neon green, which is actually background line art. The more you do this sort of thing, the more it makes sense. But it's, just a way to visually remind me what line art is supposed to be affected by the coloring, and what will be sitting on top of the coloring that I'm doing right now. So, and just going in, flatting in one of the last details, which would be the cybernetic arm and all of these gears and such. Yeah, that one piece on her shoulder here that I'm selecting right now, it almost looks like it's been stapled in or riveted in through the flesh of her shoulder into the arms, into the shoulder and the bones through the flesh. Now here it's very open. There's the very open line art. A lot of it's not touching each other. So I want to do this as one large mass that I'll be going in and hand painting later. So this is the robot she's crushing. And keeping it all, I could have it be multiple different colors, and I may do that when I actually get to the painting stage. But for right now, I just wanted to leave it all as one large holding color. Then choosing this purple for the pants. Again, it doesn't make any difference as to what the actual color will end up being that I'll be painting with. I just know that when I'm painting her pants, I want to paint all of of her pants at the same time. So I'm making it all the same color, so I can then use I can select it later. This is all being selected using the lasso tool. Anti-alias is turned off, and this feather is set to 0, so it's a super sharp selection, which is something you can do when you're working at 600 DPI. It won't, because it'll look sharp but not overly sharp. Like if you zoomed in really, really tightly, they'll actually have this weird, almost stair step pattern. It won't print like that though. It won't look like that. But if I was to turn anti-aliasing on, then the line would have a slightly fuzzy edge. And every time you went to select it using the magic wand tool, it'll select approximately what you originally put down. But because there's a fuzzy edge, it won't necessarily select all of the color that you chose. With anti-alias turned off, it makes a super sharp edge. So when you use the magic wand tool with the same settings, it'll select exactly the same amount, exactly the same color that you put down there. There won't be any weird edge between, there won't be any buffer between the colors. If you take a look at Scott McCloud's book, I believe it was his second book. It wasn't Understanding Comics. I believe it was in the sequel. He was talking about using Illustrator and using Photoshop in coloring comics, and describing the difference between the two, where basically coloring in Illustrator is like coloring with math, and coloring in Photoshop is like coloring with sand because of that fuzzy edge you can get on things. I'm kind of splitting the difference by making sure everything has a super hard edge on it. I don't worry about things turning into sand. All right, so all the flatting has been done. All those various layers have been set up with simple flat colors, and now going in and painting the deep background. So As stated before, I wasn't using that light blue anymore. I changed it instead. I have this basic red-blue color palette that I created quite a while ago that I like using for these sorts of pieces to keep the coloring consistent and at least to give me a starting place. So I laid down the darkest blue color from that palette. I tend to work almost always from dark to light, where I'll put in the darkest color and then I will paint the light into that. Now, there can be a danger with doing that, and the danger is it might end up printing too dark. It might end up printing darker than you think it's going to. So, and that can be a real danger when you're doing stuff in Photoshop in general, because you're painting everything on a computer monitor, which is backlit, and everything automatically looks more dramatic and backlit. So it's very easy for you to paint something, and then you print it, and you wonder why everything looks like it's been soaked in oil, why everything looks so dark and muddy. So you have to keep an eye on things like that. But I've been doing this for quite a while, so I've gotten a really good idea on, well, frankly, this is also where the notion of painting with math comes in. I have the sliders at the top of, basically in the middle of the screen where it says color. That's the CMYK value. Knowing what that looks like in print versus what it looks like on the screen goes a long way. Fundamentally, I do everything with the intent of printing it. So knowing what those colors mean, what the actual math looks like when it actually gets printed, helps to make sure things won't print too dark. So here I am working on the middle layer on this wall of computers and electronics behind her. And it's all using this select grad method that we had used back at Digital Chameleon. I still use quite a bit on things like this. If you take a look at my Instagram or my Threads or my Blue Sky accounts, I talk a lot about this image was a digital illustration. This image is inks to color. One of the differences then is a digital illustration would be completely freehand painting in Photoshop, where I'm not doing a lot of select grad. It's just using brushes all the time. Something like this, though, I will make a quick selection with the lasso tool and then use the gradient tool to paint the color in. That was a quick tutorial. I've talked about this in one or two of the other videos as well. Now, here's where I'm dropping in other pieces of artwork to act as images on these computer displays. Now, this is all, speaking of digital illustrations, these are actually all digital illustrations I've done before. Those two that I just dropped in there with the model with a friend of mine named August. Another one, I have a different model here, and the third one that I'm coloring right now. These were all done where I sketched out the idea on a tablet or on a computer, and then just started freehand painting in Photoshop. So there is no traditional art step. These were never done on paper. They were never penciled or inked on paper. Everything was done just directly in Photoshop or directly in IBIS Paint X. They're still using traditional painting and drawing techniques. Essentially, the way that I do it, freehand painting, my digital illustrations are, think of it as you're painting with acrylics, only there's a lot less to clean up because you're just doing it in Photoshop. So I'm still using a stylus to mimic a brush, but I'm still making all the same decisions in Photoshop that I would if I was painting acrylics on a canvas. All right, so that middle ground is done. I painted some lighting effects over top of those digital illustrations that went into those screens to give it the effect that they're not just little cardboard cutouts, but that they're actually on a high reflection, glossy glass screen. This is one of those places where the cyberpunk aesthetic gets a little wonky. It is meant to be the future, but it's the future of the 1980s. So I still like playing with CRT monitors. I'll make them a bit flatter than they may have commercially been in the 80s, but I still want to have them look like they're sheets of glass in a way that you don't see today. There'll be a lot more. You can get certainly glassy flat panel monitors and TVs, but it's a lot more prominent in older stuff. Oh, and dropping in another one of these illustrations. Oh, this is with my friend Erica as the model for this particular painting. Doing the same thing. I'm just taking that illustration, using the transform tool to place it into this this particular monitor screen, cutting away anything that would go outside of it, but then using lighting effects on top of that to work with the blue light coming from above, and I would actually be adding in a red light coming from below as well. But basically, yeah, to indicate that these are images on a screen, that screen itself is a three-dimensional object in the environment. So not only do I have to have the image in the illustration, I have to have what it's being displayed on in the environment and being affected by the same light, which is much easier to do if you're working with a glossy screen than something that's completely matte. Frankly, there's a lot of monitors you would do today that an illustration like this really wouldn't stand out as being different from the surroundings. They look more like a window necessarily than a TV screen or computer monitor. So one of the nice things about doing the cyberpunk aesthetic is that kind of stuff is still very distinct from each other. Frankly, it's the biggest reason why in things like Star Wars and whatnot, where you have holograms, they have a very particular scan line effect. It's to make sure that they still look like something other than a person just standing there in the environment, that they have to look like, no, this is a projection in the environment. They're not actually there. And you'll see that in comics still, where they'll still put scan lines on TVs, even though TVs really don't have scan lines anymore. Certainly not to the exaggerated effect you would see in comics. This is essentially heightening things like that for effect, making it slightly unreal to add to the reality. All right, so on her arm, since I've previously established there is blue light coming from above and red light coming from below, I'm playing with those particular colors here as well, using that same select grad technique, where again, I make a selection with the lasso tool and then use the gradient tool to brush in these colors. Now, the colors are based on that palette I've got in the middle of the screen, but I have the gradient tool set to screen. So if you're painting with, say, red, with a super dark red, but then use the screen setting on the tool, what it's really doing is stripping away all the color in that area that isn't red. It's not adding any additional red. So if you don't have a lot of red in that initial color, it'll turn it into this lighter pale pink, like you can see on her fingers. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's roughly what it's doing. It's more stripping away color to add light. I'm doing a similar thing here with her crushing this robot toy. The center of it is going to this white burst effect. So adding in this light color. Now, does that light color exist in real life? It might, if there's a small engine or something inside that's actually exploding and sparking with a blue light. But it's mostly meant to convey the action, the energy of her crushing that toy. And here working on the jeans, doing select grad, but very simple selections, meant to work with the texture of these particular pants. They won't have it won't go as contrasty as the arm. Her arm, it's not quite chrome, but it's pretty close. So it almost goes to white in places. The jeans shouldn't go that bright because they don't contrast that much. That's meant to show the different textures in the environment. So it's going to a lighter blue, but not quite as bright as the arm. And I'll do same thing with the various textures of clothing. Each piece of clothing is a slightly different fabric. So each of them will reflect light slightly differently. They'll have a different what's called a different albedo, basically the reflective properties of the various fabrics will be slightly different from each other. So they'll all reflect light slightly different from each other. Some will be more contrasty, some will be less. There are certain fabrics that reflect virtually no light whatsoever, in which case I'd be putting in almost no detail at this stage. And there'd be some that'll be incredibly reflective. If I was drawing something that was sparkly and was at the coloring stage, if I decided that her top here was actually sparkling, I could have done it with the same line art, but then I would add in these tiny little selections all over the place and then basically brush white or a super, super light blue or light yellow into that to give the impression of there being sparkles. But here I'm not going to go quite that bright. The shirt is going brighter. It is a brighter shirt than the one underneath it, but still not quite as reflective. And now dealing with the red light coming from below in pretty much the same manner. So not as reflective as, say, her cybernetic arm, but more reflective than her pants. Like it's going to a brighter color than her the leather or leather-esque pants she's wearing. Oh yeah, now wanting to deal with this faceplate. My initial idea for the faceplate was that it was going to be incredibly matte. It was not going to be reflecting a lot of light. But as I kept working on it and realized how few glossy things there were in the environment, I thought that I kind of liked the idea of it being much more reflective. Plus, if I made it much more reflective, well, that means I can add a reflection of her action. The fact that she is crushing this toy. I've been demonstrating it as this almost white burst effect in the center of the toy. I thought I could add that reflection into the front of this screen on her face, this piece of equipment. So adding in a reflection from above, from the blue light above, but then I want to do the same thing with this, the action that she is taking, reflecting into this Netrunner face mask, set of goggles or whatever, as well. So up until this point, pretty much all the lighting that is on that face mask is from the environment. But now I'm going to start adding in, or I will be adding in shortly, this kind of weird burst effect that's more indicative of action rather than necessarily showing the actual lighting or color scheme. And it'll make more sense in a moment once I get to it. I'm just adding in those extra 8 lights, the pattern of 4 lights on either side of the face mask. But yeah, here's where I'm adding in this additional burst. Again, it's not really that it's reflecting light. It's more reflecting an action. So, but which it isn't something that I'm explaining in the image. There's no text box saying what that is or anything, but I feel like I get the impression across in the same way that if somebody is shown swinging their fist and the artist draws speed lines behind it to show the speed at which it's being swung, you get it. You don't have to have it explained. So it's a little bit more obvious now that you can see that reflection and her hand at the same time. Now dealing with the skin tones, in the previous illustrations I've done, I did not do a lot of work with the select grad technique. On skin tones in particular. Like adding line art, the more of those selections you add, the older the character appears. Or another way to look at it is the more muscular a character can appear, or really just the more detailed they end up becoming. But in this case, because of the style of line art I did with this character, it's all about showing the emotion of the character and exaggerating that emotion. I'm also adding in a lot of additional line art. I'm going to match that by the style of coloring. So I'm not brushing in colors like I do with other figures, with skin tones on other figures that I've done in this series. Instead, it's going to be this same select grad. Not necessarily as many selections as with some of the other elements I've been working on, but certainly there would be quite a few. It also indicates the particular muscularity of the character, the fact that she is very, for lack of a better word, ripped, I guess. Although that could also be viewed as being emaciated, both of which work with a character like this. That it's not necessarily meant that she's looking after herself all that well. Probably spends far too much time hacking the planet, to use a 90s term, because I'm very old. I am quite a bit older than the average YouTube artist or Twitch artist, from what I've been seeing. So I'll be using a lot of different references than a lot of people will. But anyway, so still working with one thing to note through all of this is, even though I'm using the same color palette, pretty much everything I've been drawing, everything I've been coloring starts with a dark blue, and I paint with lighter blues and reds. It doesn't necessarily look like every single piece that I'm working on, every single element in this illustration is being done with the same colors. And it's all down to the value of those colors. How light of a blue you end up using, how light of a red you end up using, which ends up changing those colors. Like her undershirt looks a lot bluer than the torn over shirt. They were painted with the same colors, but I brushed in a lot more blue onto the undershirt. I brushed in a lot more red into the overshirt. And that was a very deliberate choice. It's why I keep using this palette over and over again, because I just keep varying how I use it, and it ends up creating different colors. Even when I end up working on the actual final book, I will be dealing with a lot of different deep shadow colors, but the actual painting, the actual color of light I'll be using will be pretty much all rooted in this same palette. So that I can have a consistent feel to the book, that everything in the environments will be lit the same way. They'll all be lit from the same sources, and the same, all those same sources will have the same color, no matter what it is that they're casting light on. But I will vary skin tones quite a bit more. I will be varying the color of a lot of other elements in the environments more, but it'll still be affected by the same batch of colors. There will be times that everything will need to be green. So but that will end up standing out when I use, and again, if you look at my Instagram, my Blue Sky, I really want to promote my Blue Sky account, my Threads accounts, my Redbubble account, all that work. Whenever, for the last couple of years, I've been chiefly working with a red-blue color scheme, but there are times I will inject green. Or if I'm dealing with heavily purple color schemes, but I inject green. The green really stands out because it contrasts very strongly with everything else I'm doing, and there's always a purpose to adding in green. So something in the environment is different. That's creating that. There is a purpose to swapping out different colors. So that's why I've been getting more and more into using a similar pattern of colors, so that it really matters when I do something different. Like, it will really make there will be a purpose to it. It won't just be because, oh, today I just wanted to play with green. No, that green will mean something. What it means will generally be up to the viewer, but there will have been a purpose. Now, for some of them, it'll be super obvious. There's one particular image I did of a robot sitting cross-legged, and she's reading a book. And behind her, it's all red light. In front of her, it's all blue light. So all the light that's affecting her is my traditional red and blue light patterns. But the book itself, as she opens it, is a green light source. And it's casting this green light up onto her. And that's meant to be something other. It's meant to indicate there's something about this book that is very different than the rest of the environment. So I won't always state what that is. Again, it's up to the viewer. Okay, so primary painting is now completed. Now I can get into the special effects. And because I separated the line art onto various layers, it's very easy to do different types of special effects. For instance, that deep background, I want that to be primarily blue. So I want to brush on a separate layer, set to screen, blue. And so that ends up casting this blue light over everything, all the coloring and the line art in the deep background. But it doesn't affect anything in the middle ground or the foreground, neither the coloring nor the line art. Takes a little bit more work at the beginning when you're first setting up this image to do that, but it pays off by how consistent everything works here. And adding a little spot blue lights here and there. There are multiple light sources that are just slightly off panel or hidden behind things, but they will still cast light over everything else. But not a ton of it. I still want it to be more or less consistent. And it pushes that background even further behind. Now I'm adding in a red light coming from below that is casting primarily over the middle ground coloring, and all of the deep background. So that serves to not only push this wall a little bit further behind the main character, but it pushes the deep background even further back. So it's not pushing the middle ground into the background. It's pushing both of those elements further back, thereby putting more focus on the main character. And a little bit of splash red and blue here and there onto that middle ground, specifically around the computer monitors to give them even more life. And then I'll be doing a little bit of lighting effects over the entire image. Not nearly as much, but I do want to have a bit more reflection in some of the cybernetics and on her mask, on her Netrunner mask here. But all of this just serves to enhance the image, to bring everything to life a little bit more. And I'll create multiple special effects layers. Basically, if I'm going to switch between colors, if I want to have red come from one direction and blue to come from a different direction, those will be two separate layers. So if I want to fix them or change them in some way, I can do them individually. So I'm not accidentally putting both blue and red on the same layer. Once in a while, if I want something to go really, really bright, I'll do a layer that has white special effects, and that'll be, again, its own separate layer. But yeah, we're getting into the end game here. This is just these extra special effects. And now we have the finished Angry Netrunner image. Thank you very much for hanging around. Hope to see you in the next video.